right. Hello. Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Tim Shiner. I'm a designer here at Salesforce, and I'm going to be your presenter this session. All right. Before we get into the talk, I just want to start by saying thank you. I realize well, first of all, thanks for getting up so early and coming here. I realize you have a lot of other things you could be doing, like sleeping a little longer, more coffee. There's also a lot of other great talks going on, and so I do not at all take it lightly that you decided to come to this talk, and I will therefore do my level best to communicate to you some ideas that I think will make your app dev process go a little smoother. So this talk's going to be a little different than some of the other talks that are more focused on like our technology and our great products. Nonetheless, they asked me to show this to you and remind you that you need to make your purchasing decisions based on the features that are in the product right now. Okay. So I've been at Salesforce just a little less than 3 years. In that time, I worked on the design system, I've worked on the IoT product, and now I'm working on something that we call platform products. But as you can tell from the gray hairs, I've been in the software development business for about 25 years. Enterprise, small company, commercial or consumer, web, desktop, small, large, and I found all those projects, every single one, there was one consistent thing that was the hardest part of every one of them. And before I tell you what I think that is, I'd be interested to hear when any of you have an idea of what do you think is the hardest part of developing software? Just shout it out. What? Data model. Okay, that's a good one. Yeah? Figuring out what the heck they want. Okay, that's probably closer to where I'm going. Anybody else? Design? Okay, for me, what I found over and over again, it's basically this communication part. It's this aligning with your partners that you're making the software with. And so because I kept running into this problem over and over again, I kind of eventually developed a method or an approach to mitigating this problem. But however, before I get into the solution, I want to kind of level set with you on like what I think is causing the problem and therefore why the solution I'm going to tell you I think makes sense. So let's imagine that we're making a product development team. So we've got a product manager, of course. We've got a developer, of course. We've got a designer, of course. Now, that certainly wasn't true 25 years ago, but I hope it's becoming an of course. And then we've got the product. Now, is there any other key stakeholders that I've left out here? Who else do we need on this team? Customer, right on. I didn't think anyone would get that right away, but yeah. End user. They don't usually come to the meetings. They're not at stand-up, but their point of view is extremely important. All right? So you have all these different personalities, different points of view, frankly, different languages. And I think that's kind of where the problem comes from, because they're all looking at this product. It's similar to how I've drawn it, right? They're looking at this product from different points of view, and they see different things. So if we take the product manager point of view, right, she can see the stuff that matters to her very clearly. She can see what she thinks the problems are, what the issues are, what needs to be addressed. She certainly has an awareness that there are other points of view, but she can't see them very clearly. And that's not a knock on her, and it's not a knock on anybody else in your team. It's just a fact of the human condition that we can try, but basically we can't ever really understand any point of view except our own. Okay? That's just how we're built. And the sort of technical term for that is unconscious bias, and there's nothing you can do about it. But I believe this is why communication's hard, because literally people are speaking different languages. So in design school, we had this saying where it's like, if you had some design constraint that you really didn't like, but you couldn't do anything about it, you had to feature it. If you can't fix it, feature it. And so what I try to do is come up with a way of saying, look, this fact has a different perspective. We can't do anything about it. How can we celebrate it? So if we return to this picture, what's really going on is this. Everybody's worried about something different. And what I've learned is that when someone's worried about something, until you make them feel like you understand what they're worried about, and you tell them, and they understand that you're going to do something about it, they can't listen to anything else. Okay? So I want to figure out a way to address this, but in a more systematic way, in a way that doesn't feel personal, right? We talk about people being worried about things, it's going to feel personal. So my approach to that is to say, look, let's think about a product development activity as a combination, a system of these 5 models. Now, probably a bunch of you are thinking, hey, what does he mean by a model? Okay, so let's take, we're going to take a little diversion into, I'm going to explain what I mean by model, and then we're going to come back to the story about how it relates to product development. All right, so models are ideas about about the world, how it might be organized and how it might work. All right, so they're not really anything you're unfamiliar with. They're just like the pictures or the things that we tell ourselves about how the world works that we use then to explain things, make assumptions, etc. So I got this definition from this article by Hugh Doverly. He's a friend, mentor, I think, systems thinker, great modeler. And so I'm going to just show a couple more examples to make sure we're on the same page. And all these illustrations I took directly from his article or was inspired by his article. So here's the canonical example, right? This guy, he gets up every morning and he sees the sun rising up in the east over the mountains, and pretty reasonably he concludes that the sun goes around the earth, okay? And that's his model. And that's how models work, right? We make observations and they use them to build a model. But then the other thing that's really interesting that happens, good and bad, is that these models then sort of frame and filter the way we think about the world, right? And this sun thing is a good example because we know, right, that at some point other people started to make more and more precise observations and realize, hey, wait a minute, it doesn't work that way. Actually, the earth goes around the sun. But when they tried to communicate that, it was a problem. Like, I remember learning, like, Galileo, like, the Pope excommunicated him for saying this, right? I mean, it's just to get the point across, right? Models are really important to people, and when you try to change them or you get resistance. So if you buy into this modeling idea, you realize, like, hey, a lot of the conversations that we have are basically things like this, where it's like, I'm trying to tell you about my model, you're trying to tell me about your model, I don't really understand your model, I can't tell whether you disagree with my model or you don't understand my model, right? So that's what I mean by model, is these ideas that we have in our head. So let's get back to product development. So you got this system of models, okay? First one, 5 models. Who's it for? That's the persona model, right? Who are you making this for? The value model. Why is it useful? In other words, why would this persona want it? Interaction model, which is like, okay, assuming that he agrees with you that he wants the value, how does he get it? How does he use it? The object model is basically like, what's this thing made of? Like, how do you explain it to somebody else, right? And then the last one, so the most technical one, is the data model. One of you brought it up. And it is how you manage state, which is, well, that's very important for software, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, so this is one way of thinking about the model framework, right? But the way that I actually think about it is like this, because I'm much more of a visual person, and so I imagine it like this, and I call it the digital machine, and I do that, well, a couple reasons. One, because I think it's kind of a cute name, but 2, because I really am trying to communicate that I believe software is a machine, okay? In the sense, it's not made out of steel, it doesn't have gears, it doesn't have pulleys, but in the same sense that, like, you want to take simple inputs and turn them into useful outputs, it's the same as a mechanical device. And the reason why that matters is because if you can reason about the development of a mechanical machine using visual and spatial reasoning, you can use those same skills to reason about a software machine. And why that's important is because although the part of our brain that speaks doesn't like to admit it, the part of our brain that can't speak is a lot smarter. And if part of what the issue here is communication, people speaking different languages, the more you can move the conversation into a visual and spatial thinking, the less you got to translate. All right, so what we're going to do now is take a trip through this digital machine. I'm going to show you, I'm going to break down, whoa, we're back. I'm going to, okay. I didn't plan that. I'm going to show you each of the models, give you a little bit of explanation of what they are, talk to you briefly about how you could make them so you can start to see how they might relate to your projects, and then we'll bring it all back together at the end. So first model we're going to talk about is the persona model. Persona model is basically a user archetype that you can use to make decisions about what's important in your product. The way you make it is you interview a bunch of people who you think are basically like your target user, all right? And, okay, I wonder if that's the connection. Because even though they're obviously all different individuals, because if they really truly all are your target user, they're going to have things in common, behavioral things. That's freaking me out. Anyways, so the point is what you do is you identify all the things that are in common, and then you use that to construct a fictitious person. So this is Thomas, and that's his picture, except for like, that's not really Thomas. I don't know who that is. That's just a model I got his photograph. But I got it. I gave him a name. I gave him a story. I wrote down things that he cares about, things that frustrate him. And then with my team, we talked about Thomas all the time. Thomas was who we were designing for, all right? And the reason why this is important, it's like, think about your characters in your favorite TV show, right? You know that those are actually actors playing those characters. Those are not real people, but that doesn't matter. Like, you connect with them. You understand that their emotions matter to you. Their story matters to you. And in the same way with Thomas. So, for example, if what it brings to us is an ability to come to agreement and create stability about what matters. So, for example, if today, let's say, you and I, we agree that Thomas's favorite color is orange, a week from now, if he asks you what Thomas's favorite color is, what are you going to say? It's orange, right? Of course it's orange, because we know people's favorite colors don't change very much. So that's a trivial example, but more important things, like if we figure out something about the workflow that's important to Thomas, or something about the language in the UI that he needs, I know that if we agree about that now, it's going to stay stable over time. And even more importantly, I know that if he's late at night programming something, and he's like, well, I could do it this way, or I could do it that way, which way would make more sense to Thomas? He does it that way, and then the next morning he tells the rest of his team about that, we're all going to agree, because he knows Thomas just as well as we do, all right? So that's the key thing to think about, keep in mind about the persona model, is that it's about connecting to the human instinct for empathy. And then you can use that to create stability around the decisions your team makes about what matters to Thomas. All right, next model, value model. So basically the value model, you can think of that as fundamentally like marketing. It's a marketing pitch for your product, okay? So this framework is like, could have come out of a marketing textbook. The important thing is, you got to say, like, my product is some category of experience. Okay, hopefully no one's got epilepsy or anything. That's really critical, because obviously, like, in other words, if you're selling spreadsheet software, and what I'm interested in is architectural design software, it doesn't matter to me. Okay, we're going to take a quick technical break here. No, that's fine. Oh, go back. Bring it back. Here, let's bring it back up. You know what it is? All right. 29 or 30. It's going to put. Okay. Okay. All right. We're back. Thank you for your patience. Hopefully I get the time back, right? Okay, anyways. So let's, all right, moving on. Let's look at example. Okay, is it still flashing? It's not it. Let's look at an example of this. So this, you get a little sense of like what I obsess about when I'm not designing software. So the back door of my house, I needed a doormat for the back door of my house. It's a little bit of a tricky situation because it's kind of shaded and it's often kind of moist back there, even when it hasn't rained, because like the famous San Francisco fog like condenses against the side of my house there and drips down. So I got these different mats. I tried them all, and trying to figure out which one is the right one for me, and it turned out that for me, this is the right one, because they all were useful for cleaning my shoes, but the rubber ones like would keep the water underneath and it would start to rot out the wood of my deck, whereas this natural fiber one, the water could evaporate, right? So for this particular persona, those are the critical things. And that's what you got to keep in mind about the value model. Like at some level, it's the simplest of all the models we're talking about this morning, but it's the one that I see over and over again in the failure mode, get it wrong. And the reason is because people lose sight of the fact that you got to be laser focused on value for the persona. And they start thinking about value for the business, and it doesn't work that way. You have to give the persona value, and if you do that, they will reward you. Okay, but you can't start with value for the business. All right, next one, the interaction model. This is the one that everyone always goes straight to, whether they call it interaction model or not. This is where everyone focuses right away. It's the most intuitive and easy just to understand. But what we need first is we're going to develop like a little bit of a formal definition. So we say user interaction, changes system state, creating feedback that the system has changed. Okay, so we need that formal definition because we need it to connect it to the data model later, but that's definitely not the easiest way to understand it, and it's certainly not the right way to design it. So let's look at some examples. First of all, okay, here's a good one, button. All right, ready? There I am, click the button, boom, I get some feedback. Pretty cool, right? I know you want to see that again. Let's do that again. Boom, click, boom, feedback. Okay, so let's break that down. Button, it starts in the state up. One, user interaction, he clicks it, that changes system state, and the system redraws the button so that you can recognize and get the feedback of that state has changed. So 1, 2, 3, all right? But now, what if I represent it like this, okay? Through time, something has a beginning and a middle and an end. What else do you know about that always has a beginning and a middle and an end? Huh? Who said that? Story, exactly, a story, exactly. The interaction model is a story. It's always a story. This is a really simple story. Let's look at a more complicated story. Something that's pretty Salesforce, right? Convert a lead. So here's the story, right? I go to my mobile app, I find my leads, I pick the one I want to convert, I do it, and then I know that the system recognizes that change, okay? That's the story, and this is actually what it looks like in the mobile app. Any of you that have ever done this, right? I don't know if you've necessarily been conscious of the fact that there was a story going on, but there was, and there is, and that's what enabled you to make sense of it. And that's the key piece about the interaction model, is that in the same way that the persona model engages the instinct for empathy, we all have a story instinct. Like those of you with kids, you know, like by the time they're like maybe 1.5, they get it. They understand story, beginning, middle, end, right? Okay, it's a fundamental way that people communicate. So what that also means is that we all have a really good instinct. I'm not going to say what you're thinking, but because it's not polite, but we all can tell when a story makes sense or when it doesn't, right? I mean, sometimes we could be wrong, but fundamentally, the point I'm making is if you're with your team and you're talking about your interaction model and you're telling the story and the story's not making sense, it doesn't, and you're not done designing it, okay? So that's the power of recognizing the interaction model as a story. All right, now, talk about the object model. But first, so you see we've got the value model, interaction model, persona model, kind of all on that side of this blue line. Now we're going to talk about the object model and the data model. They're more on the technical side, okay? But nonetheless, the object model, I mean, these are all important, but this one's kind of like the sun. This is really the most important model. And the way we're going to understand that is imagine that we're designing a game, okay? So we're designing a game about traveling by bicycle, same way like Cody and Einstein have been following along on this presentation on their bicycle. We're going to make a game for traveling on a bicycle. So obviously, first thing we need in our object model is the bicycle. But do we really need the whole bicycle? We probably don't. I mean, we could represent the entire bicycle in our software, but we probably don't need it. We only need the parts that the rider interacts with, and we can save resources by skipping the other stuff. We're going to be about a bicycle thing, so we need a beginning and an end. We need an origin and a destination model in our model, and we probably need to wrap those in a trip because we don't want to just have this a one-shot thing. We want to be able to take multiple trips, right? We might need the persona. You don't always need the persona in your object model, but in this case, it's like about someone riding a bicycle, so we probably do. And as long as we're mentioning the persona, we might just remind ourselves, what's the value model here? Like anytime you bring up the persona, it's good to remind yourself, what's the value model? Okay, so this is a good representation of the object model for sharing with you guys right now, but although we're getting closer and closer, we couldn't use this to explain the object model to a computer. For that, we need text. So how do we get the text? Do you imagine? We tell a story. We tell a story about the interaction model, and we look at the nouns. And the nouns, that's our object model, okay? So this is pretty good, but it's still not really quite in the format that you'd want to use to share with a computer. So we can go one more level, make it look something like this, sort of pseudo-JSON, and here it becomes really clear. The object model represents the names and the relationships of the objects in the system. And that might sound, I was like, okay, this is the most important model, that seems pretty simple, but again, you've probably all experienced developing software, how difficult it is to get agreement on the names. And I know a lot of times it comes across as really a pain in the neck, and people don't necessarily have the patience for working it through, but it's critical. Like, I guarantee you, if you sort of get frustrated and say, like, okay, well, you know what, I'm going to work on this, but I'm calling it this, I don't care what they call it, you will have problems down the road, okay? It's going to come back to bite you. So that's the object model. It defines the names and relationships in the system. Last one, data model. Okay, almost done. So before I explain the data model, I need to explain data. Now, this is a pretty technical audience, so probably the concept of name-value pair is not new to you. When I talk to designers, sometimes I got to explain to them, like, this is the simplest way to represent data, basically. You have a name and a value. The name represents, again, the name is some quantity that you care about, and the value represents, what either some constant or some measurement or some, the state of it right now. All right, so these are examples. This is an example. It's kind of cryptic. Probably you're wondering, where's he going with this? But now maybe some of you are starting to get where he's going with this. I'm going right here. Okay, so a little bit I played a trick on you in the sense that the data model and the object model are extremely tightly linked to the point where you can't exactly say necessarily this is the object model, this is the data model. It has to do with what level of detail you need to represent in your software, and that sort of depends on the situation. But the key thing to keep in mind, the way that I still differentiate them, is that the object model defines the names and relationships in the system across all time. The data model specifies the state of the system at any given time, okay? So that's what you need the data model for, is you need the data model to keep track of the state in the past, the present, the future, whenever you care about it. So if I know the values of all the properties of all the objects in the system, I also therefore know the state of the system. Why does that matter? Let's look at that. All right, so we're going to our game machine, right? Thomas, he's about to have fun. He starts with the seat in San Francisco, okay? That's where his bike is. There's some interaction and boom, now the seat's in Los Angeles, okay? That was a blast, right? That was his trip. And so now we can see, look, here's what it's all about. What happened is that the values in the data model changed across time. And what I love about this representation is that it's sort of both humbling and at the same time liberating to realize all the work I do with my team, everything we're doing, all it's really about, it's just about enabling some user to change a few values that are stored in the database somewhere. That's all software is, right? It's just letting the user giving the user some simple, understandable way to change the data values that he cares about. Okay, now, I don't mean to trivialize software. Obviously, as we're all becoming increasingly aware, it's incredibly powerful. It can be used for good and it can be used for evil. But I'm just saying, in the process of designing it, the problem that you really have is just making that simple machine that lets your user understand how to change a few data values. Okay? So, trying to get close to wrapping up here. So maybe a lot of you realize already what I'm trying to say is this game we made is just a specific example of the digital machine, the general thing I was talking about in the beginning. So let's get there, okay? So first of all, let's clear out the objects, represent them with that schematic. Let's clear out the data, represent that with that schematic. We clear out the interaction, we've got that schematic. We've got to say goodbye to Thomas and go back to the generic persona. And here we are back to the digital machine. Okay, so I introduced you to the digital machine. I introduced you where the models came from. I kind of broke down each one what it is. I gave you an idea of how you might create one. Before we close, I just want to go back over again why I have found this to be such a useful tool and why I think it can help you. So first of all, it surfaces assumptions, okay? What I'm claiming is that all these models exist in the minds of your stakeholders, whether they articulate it or not, whether they're conscious of it or not. They're asking themselves the questions. Who's this for? Why is it useful? How do you use it? Okay? But if you don't talk about that, then people have assumptions that don't necessarily line up. And unshared assumptions, that's basically where projects go wrong. Okay? So like I had a boss who said to me one time, Tim, we probably would have got our models figured out eventually, but we got there a lot faster with you talking about them all the time. So I want to really encourage you, talk about your models. Like initially, sure, it's going to feel goofy and weird, but I guarantee you, if you just go with it, just ask the product manager, what's the value model, et cetera. Just talk about the models. Pretty soon it'll become common and everyone will be talking about it. And more importantly, they'll be starting to draw it on the whiteboard. And like I said, engaging that other part of your brain that doesn't, the part that's physical, the part that's spatial, the part that's visual. Okay, so that's one reason why this works. Another reason is that it allows a separation of concerns, okay? So I've been clear about these things all have to work together, but I hope you can understand that you saw how you can sort of work on them separately some of the time. So what that means is like people can get out of their way, each other's way. They don't step on each other's toes. You can get off the critical path. Like if you come to a rough idea of like, what the interaction model is, then the designer can go off and refine it, while at the same time the engineer can go off and refine the object model. They kind of come back together and make sure they fit, but they were able to work separately. And last thing is that, like I was saying, I feel like it engages imagination. It lets you get in touch with the part of your brain that thinks visually and spatially, and it helps you get your team in touch with that. And I believe that is a key piece to solving the hard problems that you encounter in software design. All right, so if you were interested in this material, I wrote a blog post about it, same content. You can read it there. Also, that's a Salesforce UX blog. There's a lot of great content there if that's the kind of thing that interests you. You want to learn more about design theory, practice, methods. I really encourage you to look at that. All right, so that's my story. I'm sticking to it. But I would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes. Oh, all right. Thank you. Yes. Oh, can you either shout it out, or do you mind going to the microphone? Everyone. Oop. Okay.
You talked about the value should be related to the persona.
Yeah.
If I'm designing something to sell tennis shoes, right, and we talk to build a value model, should we be building it for the shoe purchaser or the clerk operating the software?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So that comes up all the time. Are you designing for the buyer, or are you designing for the end user? I think that fundamentally you need to design for the end user. Okay, you need to pick the one primary user. If you get that right, other personas that aren't your primary persona will still see and be able to get at the value, understand the value. But that's what I believe. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, that, and the other thing is, like, if you're crystal clear about what something does, and some people will be like, well, that's exactly what I need. Other people will be able to say, well, that's not exactly what I need, but I can see how to hack it. When you try to satisfy multiple people at once, you end up with this thing that doesn't really make anybody happy, and it's a lot more confusing to figure out how to use. All right. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of TDX.